So the first person I'd like to introduce, and I thank for her patience as I've been texting back and forth with Dr. Lee from University of New Hampshire about adjusting our schedules. So as Dr. Brown and Dr. Lee provide their talks, know that they may be somewhat compressing their comments and skipping through some slides and things. So bear with them as we go through that. But Dr. Lee, in her talk examining and deconstructing anti-racist assessment pedagogy in the K-12 classroom, I'll let you kick it off. I think that you should be able to share your screen now, Jade.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, good morning, everyone. Let me go ahead and share. All righty, here we go. Let me put it on a big screen. I have never met Maati, but I think that her presentation was amazing and really led so perfectly into what I want to talk with you guys about today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to be here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about suffocated voices, which is just the perfect segue when some of the questions that Maati shared with us is whose voice is not being heard here? Who is being silenced, and why is this happening, and how is this happening? So as full disclosure, I want to make sure you all know that I am not a Montessori educator, and I'm not even necessarily a Montessori researcher. My field of interest is assessment and evaluation. I've been involved and engaged in assessment and evaluation within the education sphere for a long time now, and I've had the pleasure of working with Montessori researchers for the last 10 years who are posing some of the same questions that I'm posing, but doing so from a Montessori lens. And so I've been grateful to have had an opportunity to collaborate with some folks. And I just want to share with you guys some thoughts about assessment pedagogy in the Montessori classroom and the K-12 classroom, and ways in which we can intersect that with anti-racism. So I'm going to go ahead and time myself because I don't want to mess up. Hold on one second, everybody. There we go. All righty, let's get started. So before I dive into telling you anything, I want to share with you a piece I wrote back in June. This is a very short piece that I wrote that I shared with my children's childcare. I have a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And right after George Floyd's murder, I was struggling. And so I just want to read this to you all briefly. It's short, but I have it here for you guys to follow along. It starts, the title is I Can't Breathe. Oh, should I be admitting folks, Angela, who are in the waiting room?
No, you should not. I am doing that.
Okay, great, thank you. It's titled I Can't Breathe. It says, I never intended to live in a place that was predominantly white. As a proud New York City native, Manhattan born and raised, I was inundated with diversity at every turn. As a full-fledged adult, I chose to live in metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Philadelphia, where Blackness was common and celebrated. But here I am, a Black woman living in New Hampshire. I came for the job, and 7 years later, I'm still here. But on a regular basis, I can't breathe. Not in the literal sense, because the air quality here is actually far better than anywhere else I've lived, but in the figurative sense. I feel like I am living in a foreign land. It is lonely being the only Black person in so many spaces. It is suffocating to know that whatever I do or say has the potential to be a representation of an entire ethnic group. And it is tiring to have to battle big and small acts of ignorance, read racism every day. No, I am not being too sensitive, and I am not over-exaggerating. Every single day. But I can take it. I have thick skin and am strong-willed. All that strength, however, withers away when I think about my babies. I had never fully considered how I would feel once I had children. I came to New Hampshire as a single woman with no kids. Now I have a Black husband and 3 beautiful Black children. and I am worse than tired. I am scared. Yesterday, my daughter told me that friends didn't want to play with her on the playground. And the very first thought I had was, here we go. I have to have the racism talk with my daughter at age 3. Is it possible that she was exaggerating? Perhaps. They didn't want to play with her because of her strong leadership skills, read bossiness. I don't know the real answer, but I know that my very first thought was that her peers didn't want to play with her because she is Black. And I am not crazy to have those thoughts when so often well-meaning white people in my everyday life have no idea that what they are saying or doing can be read as racist. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I actually feel like I have all of the questions. Are parents having conversations within their circles about what is happening to Black people in this country? Are my Black children safe when they leave my presence? Can I really raise my babies in a foreign land? How do I get some air? Now, I'm sharing this with you all because when I think about when I first started engaging in Montessori research, or really collaborating with Montessori education researchers, I didn't have any children. And so now I feel like I'm so much more aware of what happens in the education space because I'm a parent. And so I've moved from being a practitioner scholar who used to teach in the K-12 context for almost a decade and currently teaching graduate students at the university level, to what I like to think of as a parent scholar, because I come to these questions that my auntie shared with us, and I think about it from a scholar perspective, but I also think about it from a parent perspective. And I specifically think about my area of assessment and evaluation in the context of education, and what are some ways in which I can connect these dots. So on this slide, I have some definitions. I'm not an anti-racist scholar. I'm not even a race scholar. I happen to be a Black woman who studies assessment and evaluation in education in all contexts, and have had the pleasure of thinking about it in the context of Montessori education. But according to Wikipedia, anti-racism states that anti-racism is a form of action against racial hatred, bias, systemic racism, and the oppression of marginalized groups. In Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist bestseller, he defines anti-racist as one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. Now, in an application sense, thinking about education, an anti-racist educator could be one who is supporting an anti-racist policy within a teaching and learning context through their actions, or expressing an anti-racist idea within a teaching and learning context. Drilling down a bit more, because like I shared with you all, I'm an assessment and evaluation researcher, I think about this term anti-racist assessment, and I think about it in ways of defining it related to action, because so far everything we've read, the key word that keeps sticking out to me is action. And so I think that anti-racist assessment is an assessment approach that supports anti-racism, and more specifically, an assessment approach that challenges anti-racist ideas. Now, I was recently introduced to a researcher's work. His name is Inoue. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he wrote a book not too long ago called Antiracist Writing Assessment Ecologies, Teaching and Assessing Writing for a Socially Just Future. And there's some key takeaways that I've gathered from his book that help me to frame an anti-racist assessment definition more generally, although he focuses specifically on the teaching of writing. Some ideas that have resonated with me from his book are the following. It is imperative that teachers consider explicitly and robustly the function of race in their classroom assessments. Often it may be a response to large-scale assessments. And when you think about large-scale assessments, you might think of SAT or ACT, state high-stakes exams, or anything of the like. if we think that these large-scale tests could be racist, and Ma'ati mentioned that, and we know they often shape our curricula, then it seems reasonable to assume that our classrooms could be constituted by racist institutional structures. Therefore, race is a factor in our classrooms. And I don't think many of us can disagree with that, even if we're teaching a classroom full of students where they might be considered the majority. Now, Ma'ati posed some questions, and I have some questions that segue quite well from her questions. One question to consider is the following. If the dominant discourse in schools, for example, standard American English, is taught almost exclusively by white middle-class teachers, who are the population that makes up most of our teaching force in this country, then is it possible that such conditions will affect the discourse valued in assessments? In other words, if the dominant discourse reflects one culture and community, is it possible that that same discourse is what we value when we're developing and implementing assessments? So I want to talk to you a bit about fairness in testing, because fairness in testing is a concept and a topic that has been dealt with in the educational measurement field for a long time, but only recently, within the last 6 to 10 years, has it gotten its own focus and not just it being sort of a tack-on thing at the end of other topics. So within the educational measurement community, we have a Bible that's called Standard for Educational and Psychological Testing. And there's different iterations that come out, different editions, but that basically is what guides all that we do. And when I say we, I mean test makers who might work for College Board or Pearson or Educational Testing Service, as well as measurement scholars and researchers. And there's a quote that deals with fairness in testing that I think is really important to highlight in this talk. It's the following: fairness to all individuals in the intended population of test takers is an overriding foundational concern, and that common principles apply in responding to test taker characteristics that could interfere with the validity of test score interpretation. James Poppin, who is a very famous measurement researcher and has written lots of things that have been published in peer-reviewed outlets, but also practitioner-friendly outlets. He wrote this really practitioner-friendly book called Assessment Literacy for Educators in a Hurry. And he states that fairness in educational testing is as important as validity and reliability in the creation and evaluation of tests. And it must be carefully documented when practicable or feasible with both judgmental and empirical evidence. So the huge takeaway here is that fairness in educational testing specifically and assessment generally should be a primary concern during all stages of development and use. Now, this is not just for the folks who might work at these big testing companies. This is the case also for practitioners, for Montessori teachers who are developing and implementing assessments in their classroom. So there's some applications that I would like to chat with you a bit more, specifically as it relates to what a lot of folks talk about as classroom assessment, but I like to term bottom-up assessing, because we know that teaching and learning doesn't just happen in classrooms, especially now, given how many of our students around this country are in their homes learning through virtual settings. So classrooms have been somewhat redefined, but I also think about our teachers and educators who might work in community settings that are not necessarily a brick and mortar class, brick and mortar school building. So when we think about some applications in bottom-up assessing within the Montessori context, there's lots of observations, checklists, rubrics, conferences. So when we think about this issue of fairness, how can we deal with that issue within the context of Montessori classrooms? Well, there's two types of evidence that we can gather in order to determine fairness. According to Poppin, the first is empirical, and that's typically reserved for large-scale tests. But another type of evidence, judgmental, can absolutely be applied to classroom assessments when we think about Montessori education. And so these are two examples. Popham talks about peer review, and he poses the following question: might this item or observational protocol or checklist or writing prompt or test offend or unfairly penalize any group of students because of personal characteristics such as gender, ethnicity, religion, race, or language, and more? Because I think to myself, there's a participant who's in this conference who stated in the chat that he's deaf, and he asked about where is the interpreter. Well, I'm sure that folks who created this conference maybe hadn't thought of that. But that doesn't mean that folks who might not necessarily be addressing fairness in certain ways are purposefully excluding or offending a particular group. I know as a graduate instructor, it took me a while to realize that when I'm doing videos, I need to be doing closed caption. That's something that I had to learn, because when I think of marginalized groups, I typically only think of gender, ethnicity, religion, race, language. We don't think about ability. We don't think about a whole bunch of other characteristics. So these are just a few examples. And Popham says, are we reviewing the assessments that we're creating and implementing in our classrooms and considering whether or not we're offending or unfairly penalizing particular groups, knowingly or unknowingly? Also, we should be thinking about peer observations as a potential way to gather judgmental evidence. We do peer observations all the time in the educational space, but are we asking the questions of what am I missing as it relates to the assessments that I'm developing and implementing? Am I offending or unfairly penalizing any group of students because of personal characteristics? Now, there was an example I was going to share with you that was basically about an instrument development process that I engaged with some of my colleagues in, and we created an observational protocol, and we attempted to validate that protocol by doing focus groups with middle school science teachers in order to get their feedback on, number one, the validity of our underlying constructs, which one of them was this practice 6 of the NGSS science practices, but then also the utility of that instrument. And so I'm skipping through to the main point, given Angela told us to focus on time, and I want to make sure we have a chance to hear from all of the amazing speakers today. So the main takeaway here is that it is critical to include various stakeholders in early stages of instrument development. Those teachers, we shouldn't have just piloted the instrument with different types of teachers who teach in different contexts. They should be a part of the development process from the beginning, in the middle, and at the end when it comes to use. So if we think about inclusivity as an approach towards fairness, we need to think about the fact that varied voices should be included at all stages of assessment development and can be one step towards a fair or anti-racist assessment development practice, not just the development, but also the use. Now, can addressing fairness get us to anti-racism? Because the two are not the same. Perhaps I'd like to posit, because when I think of the educational measurement field that I'm a part of, the field is definitely aware that we need to create initiatives that diversify our discipline. Education researchers can also challenge themselves to consider the voices that may be suffocating as a result of exclusion or as a result of assessments having disparate impacts on particular test taker groups. Montessori teachers can also gather evidence to help determine what, if any, judgmental biases come up in their classroom assessment practices and pedagogies. And finally, since I came to this talk and started off with my parent hat, parents can absolutely challenge educational institutions to examine the types of ecologies that they perpetuate or create in hopes of eliminating racist policies and practices. So it's just so ironic that Ma'ati ended with the same questions and the same general theme of who are the voices that might be suffocating. And I'm thinking about that specifically in reflecting on our assessment ecologies. And obviously these are just some subgroups, but there's so many more. And so I started off talking about how I can't breathe. And I wanted to help you know that these, like this work, research, communicating with colleagues, communicating with my children's childcare, where now I'm on the board to help them guide the things that they do in the context of preschool education. I am catching my breath. And one of the reasons why is because I'm examining first, and some of these things I've shared with you today is about the examination process. And I'm excited to potentially move soon to the deconstruction process. And so I'm actually starting up a new project where I'm doing research related to hip hop pedagogy and how we can think about classroom assessment, or like I like to coin it, bottom up assessing, in terms of supporting innovative instructional approaches. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention.